Welcome back, everybody. What is good? I'm Joey Powell. You are tuned into InsideCarolina.com. Inside Carolina's podcast, specifically the Throwback Podcast, Episode 8. You know what we're about. You know what we do. Our name and our game is UNC nostalgia, specifically around big-time Carolina games. We want you to feel good. We want you to reminisce with us, jump in the time machine, go back, and let's talk about what was probably a really exciting game, a really exciting time. And most of the ones that we've done, I feel like have been pretty well received. I hope that you feel the same way as our listeners and now viewers, since we're doing this on YouTube too. But do us a favor, take a second right now, wherever you are, if you're driving in your car listening to us, and wait till you get to your next, stop and go and pull over and do it. But hey, stop and give us a review, right? Give us a review, give us a rating, let us know. That helps the podcast distribution algorithms bump us up to the top, so we get more exposure, which means advertisers like us more, which means they help support us more, which means we can give you guys more content. Speaking of advertisers, I would be remiss if I did not give a humongous shout out to our friends over at Johnny T-Shirt, johnnytshirt.com. They support just about everything that Inside Carolina does. They've been huge proponents of this podcast, and we're huge proponents of them. If you need gear, we just saw last week, as we're recording this now, we just saw last week they're starting to try to ease athletes back into campus, which makes us think there's going to be a football season. You're going to need gear. Don't show up to your tailgate or your first game with old gear on. Don't be that guy or that girl. Hit johnnytshirt.com. They can get it delivered to you with quickness, and they'll always keep you dressed to the nines and looking good and feeling good. And again, we want to thank them for all they do for Inside Carolina, InsideCarolina.com, and this particular podcast. Ladies and gents, this week we're jumping all the way back to January 27th, 1993. Carolina was 16-1. The only loss they'd had so far in this season, and you know how that season ended. It was a national championship, number 2 for Dean Smith in New Orleans, but Carolina was 16-1. Their only loss that year was the Fab Five in Michigan in December. And they were coming to this game ranked number 3, really, really good head to toe. They had 6 All-Americans. They weren't McDonald's All-Americans at the time. They were parade All-Americans, but 6 All-Americans. They had the 21 feet of white between Winstrom, Salvadori, and Montross, which is something that, a lot of recruitniks will remember, including the 2 guys I'm going to bring on here in a second. Florida State was no slouch either. Florida State had Charlie Ward, who would go on to win the freaking Heisman Trophy and become an amazing NBA player himself. Rodney Dobard, and this is their starting 5. Charlie Ward, Rodney Dobard, Sam Cassell, Bobby Sura, and Doug Edwards. They had 5 legit NBA guys on that team. So they're coming into Chapel Hill. They'd only had Charlie Ward for a couple of games at this point, and had not lost a game with Charlie Ward in the lineup. He came over after football was over. Florida State is coached by Pat Kennedy. They're 13-5. They're ranked number 19. Had just beaten Duke, which see that for whatever it was. But when they were leading into the broadcast, they talked about that as a big deal. Florida State were going to finish the year 25-10, second in the ACC. But again, this is a big deal because they absolutely waxed the Tar Heels for 3/4 of the game, and we're going to have fun talking about it. So I want to bring on my 2 guests today. You might remember them from other situations and services and how did I just mute myself? I'm not good at technology. I did a thing that was not what I was looking for. Tried to unmute Rob, tried to unmute Matt, ended up muting myself. Anyway, I think everybody's all here now. I want to introduce our 2 panelists today. The first one is the notorious ROB Rob Harrington, author, Inside Carolina recruiting guru, IC contributor. You've seen him anywhere. The dude is probably single best at identifying things that you're going to love in a player before he gets to campus. Rob Harrington, how the heck are you?
I'm great. Thanks for quite a rousing introduction. I'm going to have to record that one and use it for all purposes.
I mean, I stopped short of the from North Carolina. I stopped short of that, but that seems to be popular these days. And along with him, Double M, all the way from the West Coast in San Jose, Matt Morgan, also IC recruiting guru extraordinaire. He's now the longform oracle and has written some of the more fascinating pieces that have captivated my attention because I don't read a lot of stuff. So when this guy posts something, it's instant It's instant top of the list, and he's done some really good work for Inside Carolina in the long form phase recently. So want to give him a big shout out and bring him in. Matt, how you doing, buddy?
I'm awesome, man. I'm excited here talking to you guys. Like you said, if that sign in Wilmington's accurate, I'm 3,000 I-40 miles or so from Chapel Hill. So I don't get to talk that often with folks who get Carolina basketball. So I'm pumped to be here, man.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys joining us. I think this is going to be a fun discussion, as most of these have been so far. And, you know, I always lead these off and ask the guys who have been on the panel, you got to tell me, what was your memory of the game before we rewatched it? And Rob, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I would take one step back from this game and look at that season as a whole, because the 1993 season I thought was the end of an era, because it was the championship team. But then after that, even though a lot of those guys came back in 1994, you had them transitioning to the Stackhouse and Wallace era. And so it was, for me, the last of the traditional Carolina teams. I think a lot of us who grew up with the Tar Heels at that time had heard a lot about these great comebacks. And so about that game specifically, there was the Walter Davis 1974. And this turned into just one of those epic comebacks. Like, okay, now we have one of these we can talk to people about and taunt them with in later years, which is exactly what I've done, of course. And it was a magical thing to experience without even watching basketball with the granularity that I do now. It was just one of those fun, emotionally connecting types of games. It was something that was unforgettable if you saw it live.
It's funny you say that. In going back and prepping for this show, looking at it, there are actually still articles that were written at the time by the New York Times and Baltimore Sun, who were out of market publications, and they were covering this at the time. So it gives you a little bit of magnitude about the story on how it hit the national landscape. Matt, what was your memory before you rewatched it?
Well, it's funny that Rob mentions if you watched it, because my confession I'm going to start out with is I didn't watch it live. I watched the first half live. This week was the first time that I was able to see the second half. I was, I think, 10 years old at the time. I was in fourth grade at Carver Elementary School, baby. It was a 9 o'clock Wednesday start. So I watched the first half. Those. I saw us getting blitzed. I hadn't, I like to say that Carolina basketball teaches you a lot of lessons, especially Dean Smith basketball. And this was a lesson game for me because I went to bed. I put on my AM radio. It's crazy how vividly I remember my AM radio in my room right now. But I remember listening to it. I fell asleep. I woke up the next morning. My parents told me about the comeback and how Carolina won. I thought they were messing with me. But, you hear about Dean Smith and all these glowing things and it becomes a little surreal and, sometimes seeming like it's not real, right? But then stuff like this happens, right? And that you learn the lesson that a 21-point lead isn't safe. Carolina's never done. Dean Smith's never done. So that's what I remember about this game, because I saw none of the signs that would lead to you to think that Carolina's going to come back and win this game. And then I wake up the next morning and all's right with the world in a way that you wouldn't expect. So I'm taught what Dean Smith's all about. I'm taught as a spectator of Dean Smith's basketball teams what to expect and what's possible. So that's what I remember, is that it's what Carolina basketball was all about. This was one of those 4 or 5 games that kind of taught me a lesson.
I love that this game taught 10-year-old Matt the idea of faith in Dean Smith's coaching. It's neat that this was one of the seminal moments of Dean Smith's coaching. And like you said, that it showed you that, okay, I can still come back, or I can get my team to come back from, 21 down in less than 9 minutes of game action against the top 25 team that's loaded with NBA talent and still win. Matt, you're kind of the reverse of an earlier show we did about, I think it was the NC State game in 79, where the Tar Heels were up 21 at the half. Thad Williamson was on with me for that one, and he said that he went to bed at halftime with Carolina just walking the dog all over the Wolfpack, and then woke up the next morning and was just discombobulated to find out how the game had actually turned out. So I love that you're kind of the opposite end of the spectrum for that. Right. So we've talked about what we thought before the game, before we went back and rewatched it. Now we're going back and rewatching it. What were the biggest things that kind of jumped out at you knowing what you knew, we're going into this with already understanding what the outcome of the game was. We're kind of rewriting or re-looking at history. Matt, what were some of the major events of the game in your mind as you're sitting there dissecting and rewatch?
Yeah, well, I think the thing where it all kind of starts is before the game, right? Because we learn, when the tip's about to happen, that Phelps and Reese are benched for being 2 minutes late, which is just such a quaint thing to hear 27 years later. That they're benched for Sullivan and Scott Cherry, which I didn't even know was in the realm of possibility that Scott Cherry would be starting a basketball game, even in an emergency situation. But it really sets the tone for the offense for that first few minutes of the first half, really. And then, 4 minutes, 38 seconds in, Montross gets his third foul, and that kind of that's the domino that falls, right? That's what's going to set the stage for the rest of the game. And, what you have from there is Florida State has a 1-3 and chaser defense, which is what Dick Vitale calls it. I've never heard this term specifically before. And they make a little bit too big of a deal about it. But what it ultimately is Charlie Ward's chasing around, whether it's Williams or Phelps, the kind of the best player on Carolina's offense for the whole half, right? And then what that does is it leaves all of the other shooters wide open. And, under normal circumstances, okay, let's line it up. Let's have Donovan Williams start shooting some threes, but Carolina can't throw it in the ocean. They go Reese, Lynch, Rodel, and Sullivan go 0 for 12 to start the game. So that's really the stuff that right out of the gate. That's what gets us to 21 points down. So those are the kind of plays that stand out to me out of the gate.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the Montross foul trouble. That totally just broke Carolina's offense. I mean, they didn't even they weren't setting great screens. They weren't filling the different parts of the court like Dean used to like them to do on offense. Him being removed from the game that quickly absolutely crippled their offense. Rob, what did you see, as far as major events or things that you felt like, the flow of the game early on when you rewatched it?
I was struck immediately just by the passing offense. I mean, this was not something, even though Roy Williams is a disciple of Dean Smith in some ways, in terms of playing style, they've diverged quite a bit. And so this was the Carolina passing offense and the way you move the ball around with the pass rather than the dribble, which, Matt mentioned the word quaint. It's very quaint by today's standards. So even when the team wasn't playing well, watching it again, I thought, oh, actually, the offense still looks pretty good. Like they have a purpose where they're going with the ball. They just weren't making any shots. And you're right, with Montross being discombobulated, they weren't finishing well. And you saw them. I thought they were generally trying to do the right thing. They got rattled by a very talented team. I mentioned off the top, this was a prior era. Like the game looks like a prior era, but Florida State plays a little bit more modern in the sense that it's more freewheeling, as if guys hadn't been in college for 3 and 4 years, which was common at the time, not anymore. So they look more modern to me in some ways. It was just interesting clash of styles. But my sense watching it live was, oh, they've lost contact. They're going to get blown out. But rewatching it, I was like, they're really not. They're not competitively outclassed. One of those things where it's just not their day. It was sort of, maybe it's just hindsight, but I feel like watching it. Okay, they're not completely getting obliterated the way I remember. They're just not finishing plays well, and then had some external unexpected things go against them too.
Well, I mean, what are you going to do if you're not going to make shots? How do you run an offense?
Drink Gatorade.
Yeah,
that's a good point, both of you. Rob, I like the way you kind of tee that up in a sense that it wasn't like they were getting annihilated. There was a stretch in the first half, and maybe this is just Vitale banging it into my head, but you really felt like Florida State was the aggressor. But after that, 10, 12-minute window, the second part of the first half was pretty trash basketball on both sides. I mean, it was a lot of missed shots, a lot of turnovers. If I saw one pitch ahead that somebody picked off, I probably saw 10 of them, at least in the first half of this game. It was pretty ugly ball. I love that both of you guys highlighted that. What did you feel like, Rob, after the first wave of the game was, after that first initial, you always kind of feel it out like a heavyweight fight, like they're feeling each other out and they're trying to see which punches are going to break the tension, trying to see where the other guy's going to go and where opportunities are going to be. When did you feel like that settled, and what did you notice, or what was your thought when you felt like, the flow of the game started kind of taking its own feel?
I thought, I mean, at the end of the first half was basically a disaster with multiple turnovers, and Florida State got a couple of cheap baskets, an open three for Cassell. Those were the types of things that was the last thing they needed going into the break.
Yeah.
But then they came out and with renewed sense of purpose, much sharper. I think what you saw was an experienced team playing program basketball. And I'll give you a parallel. I said there were there had been a divergence between Dean Smith and Roy Williams, but that game, that start of that second half reminds me of maybe midway second half of 2007 against USC. And that was another Carolina team that did not have experience, but they were playing program basketball in a belief in the stuff that we do, and we can come back. And they were down huge to USC, and they came back and won that game. And those two games I think are similar. The plots aren't exactly the same, but you can start to see it in the second half. Okay, we believe in what we're doing, and we're just going to chip away at it, and the score will take care of itself. And so maybe a few minutes into the second half, you could see this renewed resolve. They were playing at home. It was a great crowd. And so it wasn't, again, this is hindsight, but it wasn't as shocking as I remember it being at the time.
Yeah, the ultimate belief and buy-in in what you're doing is really clutch. And I think without being in the huddle, but having read some anecdotal stuff, I think that's probably what Dean would bang on them about. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think to hop on what Rob says there, in that, so I'm gonna give two kind of frames here. What would I have thought after that first wave, watching it, not knowing the outcome? I'd have been like, maybe this team doesn't have it, right? Maybe we were wrong about them, because you're seeing the score, you're seeing a little bit of, none of these shots are going on. Maybe this team's exposed. You're not realizing, okay, well, they're down essentially two starters. Donald Williams doesn't come off the bench until 7 minutes into the game. Doesn't score until I think 6 or 7 minutes left in the first half. You're not seeing the team that even the guys that they'd have, 2 months later, and you're seeing Brian Reese shoot jump shots. Like, I kept thinking to myself, why am I seeing Brian Reese and George Lynch shooting so many broken jump shots right now? And to Rob's point, the reason they're shooting those is because that's what the offense demands. That's what the defense is giving them. They're running their offense properly, but these shots are being shot by guys who wouldn't normally be shooting them, and who would probably be shooting a little bit better than they normally would, if that were the case. So I think that I would have been back then, especially as a 10-year-old, I would have been panicking. Today, I think we often like to think about these teams as we like to remember teams as the final product. We remember them the last way that they played, which was, when I was coming into this game, I was expecting to see the whipping passes that Rob was talking about. I was expecting to, and saw, ended up seeing the defense, the great team defense. We saw that too, right? But this team's learning too, right? They're learning along the way as well. I think, if this was happening in the modern era and we could see Twitter, there'd have been teams, fire Dean, or people on Twitter, fire Dean. This team doesn't have it. They're not who we thought they were. So it's just fun to see teams have that struggle, even ones that we view as the quintessential Dean Smith team. Like, this is the one that was the embodiment of Dean's philosophy, because there's no, over-the-top NBA star on this team. So this is Dean's soul on the floor, and they still had some moments where on the surface, it looked like they didn't have it.
Yeah. Did either of you guys, and this may just be a flaw in yours truly, did either of you guys get really annoyed at Vital wondering why they weren't taking the wing jumpers? And I'm like, the defense wants you to take the wing jumper. They want you to take that. And when you're not hitting it, why should you all of a sudden just get suckered into what the defense wants you to do? I mean, am I totally off base on that?
It wasn't, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, because I think Vital, even in his prime, which he was then, was an emotional game watcher. So he very frequently commented on the feel of the game, and he's a big momentum person. And I wouldn't describe Dean Smith as a momentum coach. I think he was like, no, we're not going to allow them to take the play away from us and have them take us away from our identity, which was kind of getting back to what we were saying before about how they were believing in the stuff that they were running. And this is not the first option. Even if it's an open one, we're going to force your defense to move in a way that we get the shot that we want. So even though it wasn't working early, of course, it started to work. And as Matt mentioned, the defense in this game by both teams was I thought much more intense and heels down No pun intended. But and again, that's a byproduct of the era with a lot of more experienced players. And they really crisp rotations, not as grabby and shovey as it is now, but just great team coordinated defense.
Yeah, I tried to, I had a few notes here where I was like, God, both teams are playing terrible, and I was offensively, and was trying to say, well, Carolina just doesn't have it offensively tonight. I wasn't giving Florida State enough credit for their defense out of the gate. Their hands are in everything. Hands are in the passing lane. They're stripping anything that drops below the waist. I wanted to say they're playing physical, but like you said, Rob, they're not. They're playing strong, but
Aggressive.
They're not bumping. They're not grabbing. It's a great defensive performance by both teams.
It was clean defense. I think that's the type of thing that you like you guys both said, you really don't see a ton of anymore. I mean, Florida State's denial of the ball and the way they got their hand in passing lanes was incredibly refreshing. And I rewatching it, I'm kind of thinking if they would have valued the ball right after a turnover a little more, this game isn't close, right? Like, how many times did Florida State get a steal and then immediately throw it away? I felt like it was Groundhog Day, right?
3 or 4 no-look intercepted passes by Bobby Sura.
Yes, out of the blue. I guess because he's playing with a quarterback on the floor, he feels the need to try to one-up him and throw in a triple coverage over the middle. Or I don't know. But as good of an athlete as Bobby Sura was, this was not one of his better passing performances. Matt, I'll come back to you with this one. Controversies from the flow of from the body of the game itself. Did anything stab you in the throat there?
Well, I mean, and I feel like I'm going to lose the contest here. Who's going to mention wine and cheese first? This was the follow-up to the wine and cheese game, which I remember, at the time thinking even my parents were making a big deal about this back then. And I was like, it seems kind of dumb. Like, why is everybody making a big deal about this? It seemed like kind of an innocuous comment. Like, lower ring is quiet. Like, we know it is, right? Like, the crazies are up top. That's what he was saying. I was digging into it a little bit more over this weekend, and the NNO did a story a few years ago that kind of retrospectively was the 25-year anniversary of this comment, and they kind of looked into the origin of the quote, and so none of the writers except the NNO column writer used that quote. Everybody else just kind of let it die. The quote's different and has changed over the years, which I thought was fascinating. It's become a little bit more controversial. Like a year later, when the Orlando Sentinel finally printed it, it was like flipped around and like made to sound a little bit more controversial. So, I as an adult now looking back, it definitely seems very silly. And, especially as far as Sam Cassell goes, it doesn't really seem like a big deal. So that was the controversy in the backdrop for this. And you watch the game, and ESPN loves making a big deal about that. And so that's the big controversy for me in this game.
And they had beaten Carolina both games in '92 the year before. So whatever Cassell said, he kind of had a right to chirp a little bit, huh?
Yeah.
Rob, what do you think, man? Any controversy stand out to you in this one, or anything in your rewatch that just really made you kind of sit up in your chair?
That's the obvious one. I think there was always this dynamic between Cassell and Carolina and his belief that he was the best player on the court at all times, which I think served FSU well at times and also hurt them at other times. This is a little bit askew from the question, but rewatching it, I thought, oh, you know what? Florida State did a great job of preparing Carolina for Michigan. Michigan was a much more disciplined team, but
Simpler, though, I could see that.
But Michigan didn't make the same number of mistakes, but they had that length and athleticism. So in a way, Carolina got Michigan once. They got FSU in conference, and then they went back to Michigan. And so they had a lot of preparation at that point. I sort of had this thought in connection with, I think it was maybe the 1971 team. This is before my time, but when that team ran into Florida State also, and they got blown out in the Final Four, I believe, and it was one of those situations they weren't prepared for a team like that. And so you had this extremely athletic club with a confident player who controversially thought that he was a little bit more outspoken about it than most players were at that time, who were deferential to Carolina, especially to Dean Smith. And that gave them some really nice preparation. Just sort of an unexpected facet of the game that I wasn't looking for when I watched it.
That's a really solid parallel. I wouldn't have made that connection. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah.
Timeless highlight, right? Like there's a couple there that I think we want to kind of gravitate towards. Matt, I gave you the first question last time. Rob, I'll let you take the timeless highlight first. What do you feel like was your ESPN moment there?
Well, of course, the steal and the dunk by George Lynch. I mean, I think that was at my high school the next day. I wasn't quite as young as Matt, but at my high school the next day, that was the one that everyone talked about. It was that was the signature moment of the game, and it was the crowd. It was like perfect timing. Just the crowd was right there. You could feel that dunk through the TV, even in our lousy little non-HD TVs of the era. It was just one of those magical things, and at that point, it felt like they could not lose, even though, like 1974, you hit a bank shot to go into overtime. Well, surely they can't lose, and they didn't. And after that dunk, they can't lose, and they didn't. It was just one of those things that just felt like destiny at that point.
People forget what a great steal artist George Lynch was. I mean, he picked six that ball. It was just, he read it perfectly, just jumped out of the gym to get to it, then took it himself. Now, that said, Matt, you're allowed to choose that play if you have something else you want to say about it, or is there another timeless highlight from this game that you want to talk about?
Well, I did want to say one quick thing about that. If you pause when Sura throws the pass and you pause it, Lynch isn't on the screen, right? This is the side angle, right?
Yeah.
So Sura is about Sura's not the one. Sura's the one receiving the pass from Ward. Sura is about 5 feet from half court. Lynch isn't on the screen. He's in the Atlantic Ocean if you're looking at the North Carolina map there. And
just off of Nag's Head. Yes, we got you.
Yeah, the amount of space he makes up in a second is just amazing. But for me, there's the 5 straight threes that Carolina makes there that cuts it, that cuts the lead more than a half, down from 20 to 8 in
it was quick.
A minute 59 seconds. That was another thing that I had no idea about, is that lead disappears in 5 straight shots. Basically, it's crazy. So I'm going to go this a little differently. Rodney Dobard is just like, he's that dude, man.
He was a dog, man. He was a dog, yeah.
So Rel mentioned a few episodes ago about how we've been playing the same Duke game for 13 years. Florida State's had the same team for 25 years, where they just have these like 6'9", strong as an ox, athletic dudes.
Athletic wing forwards, yes, all of them, every year.
Yeah. I mean, Dobard has this lefty dunk. So he pump fakes Montross and drives to the lane and dunks it with his left hand. It was just amazing. So the thing that you kept expecting for a long time throughout this game, Carolina's going to make a comeback. Carolina's going to make a comeback sometime. Florida State's going to panic, right? Well, there were 4 or 5 plays there where Florida State pulls their fist back and just knocks them right across the mouth. And Dobard was responsible for 2 or 3 of those. They had the swagger of this team. And Rob's completely right. The Fab Five comparison is a great one. They also remind me a little bit of the Miami team with Shane Larkin a few years back. Just the swagger of that team, the confidence, but also that same confidence that made you think they're probably going to lose in the Sweet 16 after blowing a 20-point lead. So, so for me, if I'm going with one play, I'll go with it a little bit contrarian. The Dobard dunk is something that I had no idea existed, and it was fun to watch.
Hey, man, game recognized game. It doesn't matter which jersey he's wearing. I appreciate you calling that out. I want to throw this out there, and it isn't really a highlight so much as it was a turning point of the game. And prepping for this, I felt it, and then I saw actually Adam Lucas, who writes for GoHeels.com, had done something about this a few years back online, and it's still available if you want to go find it. But Henrik Rodel hits what I think it was either the first or second 3 that Carolina had. They went 0 for life for the first 30 minutes of this game. And Rodel hits one, and it cuts the lead to 17 points. Dean Smith calls a timeout, right? At that point, I think Florida State caves. I absolutely think that either whether it was something that just triggered them, whether they saw, Dean's calling a timeout, they must think they can win this, and it just clicked negatively for them. I don't know what happened, but I've never seen anything like this where 17 points is now all of a sudden our working margin, and Dean calls a timeout, and it immediately, like you were talking about, those couple of back-to-back threes in 2 minutes, poof, it's gone. And I feel like a lot of fans have lamented the way that UNC loses leads like that over the years. But going back and rewatching this, man, I think Dean Smith calling that timeout may have been one of the most Dean Smith things ever. because his team then all of a sudden just, okay, we're going to go now. Either of you guys pick up on that? Do you have any feelings about it, or am I totally out of left field?
I think you raised an interesting point about how Carolina fans lament how other teams do that to them in terms of the quick erasure of a lead, because typically Carolina was going to steady as she goes, and still in a normal Carolina team, they like to pound you inside. They're happy to allow you to have an advantage on threes if they're playing much higher percentage basketball overall, and over the course of a long game with more possessions, then they get some separation. So for them to be the team punching back, with shots they ordinarily wouldn't rely on, and to erase a lead like that, I mean, I think it mostly has come up in Duke games, but not only Duke games. I think the Auburn game from 2019, where they just got shelled on threes, is to see them be the one administering that kind of medicine, and especially in the context of that team, which, as mentioned earlier, was the epitome of a classical Dean Smith offense. It just shows you that, I think all Carolina fans know this, but having a preferred style of play doesn't mean that it has to be rigid. And so what I loved about the Coach Smith teams was that they were very disciplined and on brand all the time, but there was enough innovation in there, and then they could pivot off of it as needed. And this was one of those games, and that's exactly the point where they pivoted. They had no choice, and they did it. And they did it so successfully and so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that's jumped out to me, Joey, to your point, I had forgotten how calm Dean Smith was all the time.
Always so stoic.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where it's disinterested sometimes. You're coaching, right? I mean, but we like to compare Roy and Dean, and Roy is so much more animated than and you look at the way that Pat Kennedy, his demeanor, that last 7 minutes of that. Yeah, exactly. You got it. The perfect, Joey. I mean, comparing him and Dean, like the Dean's team reflected him, Pat's team reflected him, and Carolina wins.
I'm sorry. I started with the face there, but that was one of the things I put in my notes.
I thought we froze for a second there, Joe.
When they called that tech, when Lenny Wirtz assigned that, shout out to Lenny Wirtz, God rest his soul. When Lenny Wirtz assigned that tech to Pat Kennedy, and I still don't know what Kennedy did, but just the look on his face was so meme worthy, right? Like if we'd have had social media then, that would have been the meme for like 2 weeks of ACC basketball straight up. I'd like to come to a point in the show where, we say, who was this guy, right? And it can be for either team. You mentioned the Dobar play earlier being a highlight. Totally fair game. Matt, who was your this guy for this game?
So for me, it was actually Montross. And the reason for that is when there are guys with some better stat lines in this one. I mean, he has a good one, 15 and 8 in 22 minutes. But for me, I often, will get down rabbit holes and start looking up old stats from a long time ago. And you look at Montross's per game numbers, and sometimes you're like, why are we still talking about this guy 27 years later? I mean, he's like, no, never more than 15 points, never more than 8 rebounds. You remember his impact being so much more than that. But this is a great game to kind of understand Montross, because when he goes out with that third foul, everything changes.
How many minutes did he play in this game?
22.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a heck of a stat. Like that per 40 stat line is amazing.
40 straight. Yeah. But it's really, I mean, the amount of energy and attention it takes for the defense to keep Montross from rebounding and dunking everything within 4 feet. It's a lot, man. The gravitational pull of Eric Montross, literally and figuratively, is huge. And you notice him coming back on the floor, what it means to the team. There's a few right before that 5 3-pointer stretch, there are a few plays where Montross either dunks the putback in there, or makes the defense really work for a rebound a handful of times in a row. And you notice the confidence that gives the rest of the team. I mean, when Henrik Rodel doesn't have to worry about being the only scorer and Eric Montross has done 3 dunks in a row, it's a little bit, you're a little bit looser when you're shooting that 3-pointer. So you're a little bit more likely to make those 3-pointers. So, as Rob said, like when the offense is running normally, guys are going to feel more successful or more confident to be successful. So for me, Montross, this was just a great opportunity to see what he does, even when, he's not scoring 25 points or something like that. His gravitational pull is just so immense. And it was cool to see that and remember what he was way back when.
It's got to take a physical toll on the opponent too when they're playing so freaking well. Oh, and then by the way, here comes a 7-foot guy off the bench that we haven't had to defend against. And now we've got a body up against him with 10 minutes left in the game that is now officially in doubt. Rob, who was your this guy?
Well, this is an easy one, but I would do George Lynch because throughout my career, it's you can talk about players, you can scout guys, and people are like, okay, yeah, that's fine. We need a Lynch. And I mean that I can't even recall recount the number of times that I've heard people ask me that. Is he like a Lynch? We need a Lynch. And I think this game is where that comes from primarily, although it was a culmination because Lynch is a freshman against Georgetown. This was the 1990 season. The team wasn't as good as Georgetown and they lost, but he showed that like fire and a little bit more spark. The program had developed a reputation for becoming stoic. Mm-hmm. And had some disappointing tournament flameouts throughout the 1980s, most of the 80s. Lynch comes in with some of the other guys, but that game in particular, I was like, okay, I know what this question is and I know where it comes from. And he was great all season, but as Matt mentioned, you look at Montross and the other guys, there were, Montross was the featured offensive player, Derek Phelps was the best defensive player, but Lynch was the heart and soul of that team. And I think this is the game, if you had to pick one, that was his signature, this was it.
I'm glad you picked him. We're going to have George Lynch on for the post-game interview later in the show. Hope everybody will stick around for that. All right. I always make a Freudian joke here when I segue to this part of the show. But what did this rewatch make you feel? Let's get in our feelings a little bit. You can wear your fan hat if you want to. You can wear your journalist hat if you want to. Or you can just, go full Vital and scream at the top of your lungs, whatever you want to. But Rob, where did you come off in your feelings from this game?
Honestly, it made me very wistful. It wasn't just, we've talked about eras, and this was the Dean Smith era, but this was a different college athletics era. Now we are entering a new one, even from the past 5 years. College basketball has changed a ton with all the done and done and then one and done. And with the name and likeness stuff coming, which is understandable and long overdue, that all that, it's not a statement about the propriety of any of that stuff, but it's just it was different back then watching a college game that, even though the Fab Five is a perfect example of a team that had a lot of stuff going on, but it felt different because it was a destination for a lot of players. Like, this is the highest most of these guys are going to go. And the sport enjoyed immense popularity on that basis. You had rivalries that developed over the course of multiple years. You had conference opponents you played multiple times, all of them a year, and all that stuff is gone already. And we haven't even got into this new thing with name and likeness. It was a lot of fun watching it, but I do think it was a richer experience. And watching as closely as I have, I think I didn't realize how much I had missed from that era, because it has been sort of like chinked away at over time. But when you go back and you watch some of these games, like, oh wow, this was college basketball at its peak popularity, and it was just a tremendous thing to watch. And it's still a lot of fun, but you have to squint a little bit to get back to where you watch these games the way you could in the past.
That thoughtful answer kind of encapsulates why we do this Throwback Podcast. So I'm going to have you stick around afterwards. We're going to get you to record a video and audio rating and review for the show that we're going to use for a commercial from here on out on Inside Carolina. Not really, but thank you for it's a very thoughtful answer, and you get bonus points for using the SAT word wistful. Matt Morgan, you're up. What was your feelings moment for this game?
Yeah, I think it's Rob inspired me a little bit with that answer. I loved it, but it did make me a little sad for how much I've forgotten about what Dean Smith basketball was, to be honest with you. Those traps, and the defensive efficiency and the fundamentals with that seem so foreign and I don't mean that judgy. Basketball players are amazing right now, so I don't mean it as a value judgment, but it's just different. And the passing is different. And whereas you see guys drive to the basket now, back then you're seeing these passes, right? So, like I said, this was a lesson game for me. My dad was an NC State fan, so I really wasn't brought up in Carolina basketball from birth, right? I got there, right? But someone wasn't telling me this when I was 3, 4, 5 years old. I had to learn some of this stuff for myself. So, these moments, these games throughout the years that taught me something. 89 Oklahoma game, right? Where people say, Carolina's got a chance here. And you're like, oh, that's crazy. But then it happens, right? Mm-hmm. This game's another one, bloody Montross, NC State in 97, where I was there for that. And I'm expecting, Carolina to be done with 2 minutes to go, down 8 or 9 points, and then come back and win it. So that was awesome. It's like, I used to say that I heard Dean Smith speak more than I heard my grandfather speak. So he was just this kind of voice throughout my childhood to reassure me to know everything was going to be okay, right? So I think that this is kind of one of those times where it's Dean Smith in a bottle right here. It's Dean Smith in an hour-long, clip on YouTube, which was great. And it was really cool to see that again. Another thing, seeing the floor rush, the fans rush the floor after the game.
Yeah.
I mean, who would have expected that? But it seemed so organic, right? It wasn't for show. It wasn't so they'd get on ESPN. Right. That was really cool too. So I really liked seeing, a number one caliber team rush the floor against a team that was going to lose 10 games that year. That was pretty cool.
Those are two really thoughtful and well laid out answers, guys. You're making me look like a genius for being able to get you two guys to come talk about this game. I think all of the stuff you guys just canned are great ways to wrap our discussion. It was the quintessential Dean Smith game. There was a lot of places there where, he just kind of showed you how his style could work. There was a lot of difference in the ball, that was being played at the time. I mean, if you look in this game, you saw a lot of 8 to 10 foot jumpers. You don't see those anymore. But the guys at that point were still more athletic than they were prior and a little closer to what we see now. So I can see the segues there and maybe the differences and what common tenets those games still had. But I absolutely love the answers that both of you guys gave for that. Anything you guys want to touch on before we put a bow on this baby, at least for the first portion of the show? Matt, I'll go to you first since you're the farthest away. Is there anything you feel like we got to mention or we've done a huge disservice to this ball game?
One thing I did want to say real quick. I mean, this FSU team, I just think it's so, the number of pro players on there. They have twice as many NBA games played than this Carolina team, which is just not something you would expect to see. So I think they have 2 starting NBA point guards on the floor. So when we talk about the passing from Florida State too, that's just another thing to keep in mind. They have 2 NBA starting point guards in the game for long stretches, which is just really cool. I really enjoyed watching Derek Phelps play. He was a guy who, when you're 9, 10 years old, you're not wowed by defense.
Right.
You miss a little bit with him. You can see that he's athletic and he looks the part, but you didn't really get the defense. So watching him give Charlie Ward absolute fits. I mean, there are plays where he's from a defensive stance to diving to catching and throwing the ball. And it's like matrix stuff. And it's crazy. I mean, the core strength on that guy has to be insane, but he forces Ward into 10 turnovers. So rewatching him was fantastic. Seeing Donald Williams go from a guy that Dick Vitale calls an instant offense guy off the bench in January to the most outstanding player, shooting 60% in the Final Four from 3-point range, was just awesome. Henrik Rodel, I thought, was just such a unique player too. He didn't have the best game in the world, but he's a guy that I also don't have huge memories for. But I didn't expect him to play so much point guard. His ball handling, his passing instincts, it was really cool. So rewatching, relearning about those guys again was fun.
Yeah, I liked the Rodel piece just because, again, the game had not been officially globalized. I mean, we were 1 season away from the Dream Team. So we had seen a little bit of it, but we hadn't seen the global influx that we have now in the modern game. And Rodel was very much a European ball player, but it was really cool to watch. I'm with you on the love for Florida State's point guards, but also the fact that Derek Phelps was in Charlie Ward's shorts all freaking game, and it's refreshing to watch because when you see guys like that have that defensive dog in them, it'll get you fired up a little bit. Rob, what's the one thing that we can't wrap the show without talking about?
Well, this is a little bit of an old man complaint. I acknowledge that up front. But I love the game presentation. the graphics were not intrusive. You didn't have ads crawling down the side of the screen constantly. The court was clean. You didn't have all the stuff around the court like you do now. It was beautiful to watch. It was like fans basketball court. The score was simple. There weren't 1,000 gimmicky sounds coming through. It was so refreshing. I didn't feel like I was getting assaulted for watching it. So I really enjoyed that.
Oh, I mean, seeing 10 guys, like you don't have that anymore. And we've got such a better technological presentation as far as, how good cameras are and what they can pick up. And yet we're using less of that on the screen, right? Like the 16:9 is now, 1/3 of Tom Izzo and who Michigan State is playing on Tuesday night, right? For 20% of the game. Not interested. I agree with you. I'll tell people to get off my line with that same line, because I think you're onto something there. There's a little refreshing angle in being able to just see basketball.
Mm-hmm.
Boys, this was fun. I appreciate you guys joining me and kind of looking back on what, while it might not come to mind as one of the best Carolina games, I think it is very much an all-time Carolina game for all of the reasons that you guys may have mentioned and kind of built out a great story for. I appreciate you guys joining me. I want to give one more shout out to Johnny T-Shirt for sponsoring the show. We're going to try to hit a break here in a second. We'll be back on the other side talking with Rob's favorite guy and the MVP of this game, Mr. Highlight Man, George Lynch. But I want to say special thanks once again to Matt Morgan, coming all the way live and direct from San Jose, California, and Rob Harrington coming from his master abode where he concocts all of these great write-ups on players that you're getting ready to see in Carolina uniform. But guys, I appreciate your time, appreciate your talent, appreciate what you brought to the show today, and hope to catch up with you soon.
Thanks, Joey.
Thank you.
All right, take it easy.